Good evening. Ooh, I love that. Voice of God. Not even close. My name is Clifton Truman Daniel, and it is my pleasure. Boy, you don't have to do anything in this job, do you? Thank you. I'll leave now. It's my pleasure to welcome you, all of you who are here in person, and those of you who are joining us online, to the 2024 Harry S. Truman Book Award event, hosted by the Truman Library Institute. And for those of you who don't know what that is the nonprofit that my grandfather created to help the Truman Presidential Library thrive, truly thrive, as a center for the study of the American presidency. I want to thank the Institute's board of directors and our friends and members in attendance for their support of that institute and of the Harry S. Truman Presidential Library and Museum. In particular, I would like to recognize the generous couple who have permanently endowed the Truman Book Award, Mary and John Hunkler. Okay, Mary, it says in my instructions, make you stand, but if you won't, I can't do anything about it. Thank you both very much for this. My grandfather would be honored and thrilled, frankly, by the audience for tonight's event, which is one of the biggest turnouts in the history of this award. So thank you all for coming. It mattered to my grandfather, reading. For him, books constituted a crucial pillar that upholds our democracy, which is probably why the only time he ever read to me, it was Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War. I was 4. For my grandfather, who led on the battlefield and in the courthouse and in the Senate and the White House, books held the essential lessons of leadership. In fact, as you all probably know, he was fond of saying that the only thing new in the world is the history that you don't already know. For many of us, myself included, tonight's honoree, Steve Drummond, has proved this adage with his book, The Watchdog. More on that in just a couple of minutes. First, I would like to note that the Truman Book Award is part of a larger research grants program. To date, the Truman Library Institute has granted more than $3.4 million in research grants, dissertation year fellowships, the Scholars Award, and of course the Truman Book Award. These grants ensure that students and scholars have the opportunity to conduct research at one of our nation's greatest archives, the Truman Presidential Library, and that the consequential era of my grandfather's life and presidency continues to be examined and widely understood. This, of course, is possible only because of your annual support, and in the case of the Truman Book Award, the generous gift of time and talents from our esteemed Truman Book Award Committee. This year, the committee reviewed 22 contenders before selecting a winner, 22 new histories focused primarily on my grandfather's presidency. Grandpa said it best when he said, this administration is going to be cussed and discussed for years to come. And just as a note, a personal note, when you're a president's grandchild, they give you your ancestors' history in small pieces. And I learned all about my grandfather's presidency before I even realized that he had been a senator and had been a senator of such import to this nation in the years leading up to and during World War II. And my favorite story from that time was, though, that after Pearl Harbor, my grandfather went to General Marshall and said, put me in. I'm a lieutenant colonel in the Missouri National Guard. I want to fight. And General Marshall said, you're too damn old. And my grandfather said, wait a minute. You're 4 years older than I am. And General Marshall smiled and said, yeah, but I'm a general already. Go back to the Senate where you're doing good. I'd like to thank the Truman Book Award Committee for their tremendous contributions and welcome to the stage the chairman of that committee, Jason Parker. Jason is a good friend, a distinguished member of our board of directors, and a professor of history at Texas A&M University. So I'd like to invite him to the stage now to introduce the winner of the 2024 Book Award program. So please give Jason a warm round of applause.
Good evening. I should know better than to try to follow Clifton, but this is how the program took shape, so here we are. Thank you, Clifton, for the generous introduction. Thank you to the Hunkers for the generous support of an award that is now in its 6th decade of being granted. Established in 1963, the Book Award recognizes the best book published within a 2-year period, dealing primarily and substantially with some aspect of the history of the United States between April 1945 and January 1953, or with the life or career of Harry S. Truman. I am one of 2 historians on the Truman Library Institute Board of Directors, and it is thus my privilege to chair the committee that Clifton was describing. I can tell you that the 2024 competition was unusually tough, but the committee agreed unanimously that Steve's book distinguished itself especially finely. His book, The Watchdog, which Clifton didn't give you the subtitle, but How the Truman Committee Battled Corruption and Helped Win World War II, tells you why I think this book resonated so strongly with the 5 professional historians on our committee. Our statement in awarding the prize was as follows. In The Watchdog, Steve Drummond makes a vital and enjoyable contribution to the historical literature by illuminating an overlooked chapter of Harry Truman's political life. Drummond's book grabs the reader from the very beginning with the dramatic story of the sinking of the SS Schenectady, and then carries us through the ways in which then Senator Truman worked diligently in a bipartisan manner to ensure that similar disasters could be averted. Along the way, we see the development of the traits that shaped Truman's subsequent presidency. But Drummond effectively draws our attention to the crucial, if largely forgotten, role that Truman's service in Congress played, helping to ensure that U.S. industry could create the caliber of ships and equipment that the nation and its allies would need to win the Second World War. In that storytelling, the author forces the reader to discard, or at least question, the myth of U.S. industry spontaneously coming together and becoming the effective arsenal of democracy. Here, as I invite Alex Burden, Executive Director of the Institute, as well as Clifton, back to the stage to help with the presentation of the award to Steve Drummond, I wanted to riff a little bit on what I think is especially important about Steve's book. It achieves one of the things that historians most aspire to. He found a piece of the puzzle that we didn't even know was missing. The arsenal of democracy shorthand for the miracles, and really you move quickly past the language of logic and science and reason and into magic and miracles when you're talking about the scale of the achievements of U.S. industrial production during the war. It's accurate enough, but it's important to note, as what I think the greatest living historian of World War II, British historian Richard Overy says in his marvelous book, Why the Allies Won, this isn't just a matter of who had more tanks. This isn't just a matter of who had more stuff. It is a matter of the systems of the various belligerents finding ways to marshal those resources and direct them toward victory, which the Allies in the end could do and the Axis could not. One of the reasons the Allies could do it owes to the role that Drummond uncovers Truman having played in this earlier feature of the story. It's not something, the arsenal of democracy, that emerges full-grown like a Cena from the heads of FDR and George Marshall or the Henrys, Kaiser and Ford. Drummond's book shows us that Harry Truman himself played an absolutely vital role in ensuring that the United States could furnish its allies with the weaponry needed. Just to put it in a sort of perspective, when the war begins, I quiz my students on this sometimes, I ask them to rank the world militaries and tell me where the United States military stood in the power table. And no one maybe knows this, but gold star if you do, the answer is 17th, below the mighty military powerhouse of Romania. When the war begins, the military itself is tiny, and its equipment is tinier still, and most of it outdated. The fact that you can go from that standing start to, by the end of the war, producing a B-24 bomber once per hour is owed in no small part to the work that the dogged, persistent, tireless Truman Committee did during the war itself. Steve's story shows us this. He'll share it with us tonight. If I can bring Alex up on stage to help with the actual presentation of the big check and the fancy award. I'm not sure where they are, but join me in congratulating, as we welcome to the stage, Steve Drummond, author of the Watchdog.
Hi. Good evening. Wow. A lot of lonely mornings at 5 a.m. staring at a blank computer screen, and it was and a lot of days sitting in the National Archives or here in the Truman Library. This is an unbelievable and unexpected, completely surprising honor, and a particularly meaningful one for the reasons that you all just heard. And so I want to thank the Truman Library Institute for this amazing chance to come and talk to you about the book. Pleasure to meet Clifton Daniel Truman. That's a great honor. Jason Parker, an actual real historian. Thank you for those incredibly kind words. I looked at the list of books up for consideration for this, and I couldn't help but notice there were a lot of real serious authors on there. So to have my story included and chosen from among them is still a great honor. And so I'm delighted to have the chance to stand here tonight and talk about the book a little bit and how I came to write it. I can tell you what happened to my hands too. There was a sliding glass door, and I thought it was open and it wasn't, and so I'm fine, but I won't shake your hand probably tonight, or I shouldn't anyway. So to talk about the story a little bit and how it came to be, I just thought I would share with you this article that appeared in the Atlantic in February. It's written by Bernie Sanders on behalf of 5 other senators. And it's about runaway spending in the defense budget. You've heard these stories before. And Sanders wrote, "Our country spends, with almost no debate, nearly $1 trillion a year on the military, while at the same time ignoring massive problems at home." He cites a couple of examples: giant defense contracts, dividends going out to big corporations, et cetera. And then he gets to the point. There's a name for all this. It's called war profiteering. And he and these other senators had a solution. You can see it in the subtitle there. Congress should curb war profiteering with a new Truman Committee. That's not the first time this has come up, and one of the things that I learned as I researched and wrote this story is pretty much if you take any of the major congressional investigations of the last half century, whether it's the Watergate investigations or the Church Committee looking into the CIA, or Kefauver in the early 50s on the mafia, or the investigations into the Kennedy assassination, it's kind of got into my head that all of them owe their DNA back to this one committee, this one wartime committee, the Truman Committee. Nobody is like, oh, we need another Kefauver committee, or no, we need, like it always ends up hearkening back to the Truman Committee. And I think there's a really good reason for that, and that's kind of the story that I set out to tell. Look, all over social media forums, you can see this all the time. Oh, we need a new Truman Committee. Here they're saying Russia needs a new Truman Committee, which I thought was kind of funny. But it keeps coming up. One of the questions I've gotten a lot since my book came out, and I wondered aloud myself, is how come nobody ever wrote this book before? I just got to answer that question the other day. And it's a really good question. Another way of looking at it is, okay, you'd think David McCullough's 900 pages pretty much said everything you need to know about Harry Truman, and then some. But one of the weird things is, when I learned about the Truman Committee myself, I was researching an article I wrote about 20 years ago for a magazine in Detroit about Detroit during the war. You know, Rosie the Riveter, Miracles of Production, all of this stuff. But I also ran across a reference to something called the Truman Committee coming to town to investigate. And I'll talk about that in a second. But it was kind of weird that, to go back to McCullough's book, on the summer drama of 1944 of who was going to be Roosevelt's vice presidential nominee to win the nominee for a fourth term as president, McCullough devotes to that 6 weeks of drama 44 pages. On the 3.5 years that came before that, the 3.5 years in which Truman learned how to become president, the 3.5 years in which, as I say, he saved a lot of money, saved a lot of lives, helped win the war, 39 pages. I find that really puzzling. And I've read a whole bunch of books about Harry S. Truman. Most of them give the Truman Committee years maybe a chapter, if that. It's kind of funny. I always feel like they're kind of in a hurry to get to the good stuff. Let's get to the atomic bomb. Let's get to firing MacArthur. Let's get to all that stuff. And they just skip right over this period. But what I kind of got to see and enjoy was watching Truman learn on the job. That was the absolute fun thing. I also have to think, the person who I have to thank possibly more than anyone else for writing this book is Bess Truman and her hatred of Washington, D.C. Because Truman loved his wife, and when Bess was away from Washington in Missouri or in Independence or wherever, Truman wrote her a letter. And so I could and did go through tens of thousands of documents in the National Archives that would tell me all about the policy decisions and the factories they were investigating and all of that stuff. But it's really awesome because of these letters to know what he had for lunch that day, or what he was thinking about Franklin Roosevelt, or who he was angry at the Senate, or whatever, or what he was saying to his teenage daughter that night in his letter. Those kind of things help the story come alive, and so I'm grateful that I got to do that a lot. So I was talking about this magazine article I was writing about Detroit and the Motor City. You all know these stories. Rosie the Riveter is out there. My grandmother was probably looked a lot like that. She ran a drill press in my hometown of Wayne, Michigan, which is not too far away. Sorry, I hit the button wrong. I'm still not getting this hang of this. All of these production miracles that we talked about, as this guy said in one of his fireside chats, we must be the great arsenal of democracy. I want to give you the actual numbers because they're pretty darn cool during the course of the war. Listen to this. Even today, they're big numbers. 100,000 tanks and armored vehicles, 310,000 airplanes, 806,000 heavy trucks, 12.5 million rifles, and my favorite number, 41 billion rounds of ammunition. It's pretty incredible stuff, and as we heard, it wasn't just this automatic thing. You just read about this, or you see this photo in your history textbook in high school, and you kind of think this was kind of automatic, and it wasn't. And the way I got into the story was about this place. This is called Willow Run. It's what used to be a farmland owned by Henry Ford, Henry I, in a place called Ypsilanti, Michigan. Willow Run, a few miles from where I grew up. My grandfather worked briefly during the war in this factory, as did tens of thousands of other people. And it's a great story. That plane there is the B-24 Liberator. Until later in the war, it was the workhorse of the American bomber fleet. It was a very good bomber. And by the end of World War II, you can see right there, the cool thing about Willow Run, the assembly line in this factory was more than a mile long. It actually curves to the right here, and it goes up that way even further. They had little electric trains to drive people around because it was so long to see and tour the place. It's a really impressive place. But early on in the war, it was not working. They started to build it. The Ford Motor Company, it turned out, didn't really know how to make airplanes very well. They thought they did, but they didn't. They thought they could make them like a steel car, like a Model T, and it didn't work that way. A huge problem was housing. My grandparents could have told you that because they lived in incomplete housing in Wayne, Michigan, where the shell had been constructed, but no walls had been put up. They tacked up bed sheet to make walls between the homes. They were so desperate, 30,000 people to work in this fan, and there were no roads. It's 15 miles or so from Detroit, Willow Run is. There were no roads that could get these workers to Willow Run to work there. So this place was a mess. And then finally, one of the things that kept happening was these B-24 bombers would get out into the combat zones, and the pilots would call back and say, you know what, we need more armor under the seats, or, oh, there needs to be a machine gun over here because the planes are coming at us from this angle or that angle. And the military was constantly demanding changes in the process. So I ran across the references to the Truman Committee showing up in Ann Arbor and Ypsilanti, Michigan to investigate. And that 20 years ago led me down a many years long internet rabbit hole of the young men and women that Truman hired to work on his committee. Lucky for me that amazing folks at the Truman Library have digitized a lot of their stuff. And so even 10, 15 years ago, I could go online and I started reading some of these stuff, the oral history accounts of some of the young men and women Truman hired to work on this committee and to do these investigations. All of them to a T were inspired by Truman's leadership, but usually what you read is them saying, I was 22 years old, I was fresh out of law school, this was the best job I ever had in my life. And I got to know these people through their oral history accounts or through their papers, but often through their descendants who were very generous over the last few years, their children or grandchildren spending a lot of time late at night on Zoom calls telling me about their relatives, about, oh, here's the Truman Committee at the bomber plant. This is when they came to Willow Run. I always wonder who this kid is and whether he's still alive, which would be possible. But anyway, they showed up to investigate, and that's the story. But anyway, one of the oral history accounts I ran across was by this guy. That's a guy named Bob Irvin. In 1941, literally, he was 23 years old, just graduated from the University of Michigan Law School. You might catch a theme there. He came to Washington looking for a job, and somebody said, hey, there's this committee hiring over in the Senate. You should check it out. And he joined the Truman Committee in February 1942. Or this guy, Wilbur Sparks, he had just graduated from the University of Missouri Law School in the summer of 1941. He was attending with his father the Masonic Convention that year, the statewide Masonic Convention in St. Louis. And walking down the street, they ran into the head of the Missouri Masons, Senator Harry S. Truman. And they strike up a conversation. The proud father is introducing Wilbur to the senator. Truman says to him, so what are you doing now? You're graduated from law school. Wilbur says, I'm probably going into the Army, but I'm going to, well, what are you doing in the meantime before you go in the Army? I'll probably just spend the summer working at my dad's law firm. Truman says to him right on the street, I got a better idea. Why don't you come to Washington and work for me? I'm starting up a new committee. Wilbur gets a letter in the mail a week later and tell him when and where to show up in Washington, D.C., and his whole life changed on there. I got to know his daughter, Sally. She's retired and lives in Virginia now, and she told me a lot of these stories and sent me a lot of cool photographs of them. Or finally, I'll just introduce you to these two folks. On the right is Shirley Key. She was 22, just out of, I forgot her college, I'll just fess up to that. She was right out of college. She got a job as, of course, in Washington, being a woman in Washington in the 40s, she got a job as a secretary. And she eventually got promoted up to run the whole secretarial pool. After that, she would become the administrative assistant to the chief counsel of the committee, Hugh Fulton, who I'll talk about in a minute. And then I'm just going to spend a moment on the woman on the left there. Her name was Marion Toomey. Her children, I spent a long time on Zoom with them, and they sent me a clipping. And it was a photo of Marion a few years before that, and it said, "Pretty Miss becomes lawyer." And basically, she had graduated, and it said she had just become the youngest lawyer in Washington, D.C. Her father was a law professor, and so when she wanted to go to college, of course, he told her no because only boys went to college. And so she got a job. She took a lot of stenography classes, and she won a writing competition, which came with a college scholarship. And she chose to go to law school, skipping right over undergraduate school. And so she got this degree at a very cool young age. Anyway, so of course, she got hired on the committee as a secretary. Yep, exactly. But eventually, she did work her way up, and she became an investigator. She got to use her legal skills as an investigator. Awesomely, later in life, though, she raised a family. She had 5 children. She raised a family, and then when she was tired of doing that, she lived in Southern Virginia. She became a pro bono lawyer. She worked at a public law firm, helping families with their family law troubles, fighting with the landlord, or getting divorced, or working with the government to get aid or whatever. And she did this for 40 or 50 years. At one point, they had to lay off somebody in her office, and a younger person with less seniority was going to get laid off. And Marion basically said, nah, I'll go. And then she resigned, and then she just showed up the next day for work, and for the next 20 years after that. She won some awesome award as the Pro Bono Lawyer of the Year award or whatever in Virginia. She lived to be 100 years old. She died in 2016, and one of the things that bums me out is I was working on this book at that time, and I missed by that much the chance to get to meet Marion Toomey. But her children were wonderful, and they shared their stories. So in other words, it's as much a story about Truman, or at least about what got me into writing this story, was the story, the inspiring stories of all these young people saying, here I was right out of college, and I'm literally in the Capitol building meeting with cabinet members and the chief of staff of the Army and the heads of the biggest corporations. And they all, to a person, pretty much said this was the most exciting job they had ever had. And me, as some of you may know, my day job is I'm a journalist. I work at National Public Radio in Washington. But the reporter in me is reading this stuff and saying, man, I think there's a story here. And I'm going back to the McCullough book or any other book on Truman I could find and saying, God, I want to know more about this. And I couldn't find it. So that's how this book came to be. Where am I going next? Oh, yeah. So the Truman Committee and Washington at that time ran on paper, lots and lots and lots of it, tens of thousands of pages of data and questionnaires, surveys, government contracts, all of this stuff. Most of it's in the National Archives in Washington, D.C. The records of the Truman Committee take up about 700 feet of shelving space in the National Archives. So this is one of my research days here. That's about 8 of those shelving feet. That's about 8 linear feet, they call it. And so I would go in on my days off from NPR every now and then and read those documents and work my way through. When I started working on this, many of these files hadn't been opened since the 1940s. And so that basically is how I got into this story. I've given versions of this talk before. I'm sorry if some of you heard it before. But then again, I thought, well, if you read the book, you've heard all of this before. So I guess it doesn't really matter that much. But the story begins on a cold winter morning in 1941 on Connecticut Avenue in Washington, right across the street from where I used to live. Early in the morning, when Harry Truman walks out of his apartment one day, he gets in his car and he drives off. At that point in his life, he was about as unknown, about as much of a nobody as a United States senator could be. He had been in the Senate for 6 years in which pretty much he had done not very much at all. There were no bills with his name on it. There were no committees he had chaired. He had basically sat quietly and learned. He had been a good soldier for the New Deal, but that was pretty much about it. And so I found a document in the Truman Library that counted up all the times that Harry Truman met with Franklin Roosevelt as a senator in his first 6-year term and in 3 years before he was chosen vice president, 9 years or so. From 1934 to 1944, Truman met with the president 6 times, usually for about 15 minutes. So he narrowly won re-election to the Senate in 1940. Most people hoped, including the President of the United States, expected him to lose. You can see a storyline in his life there that goes on to later times. And when he came back from winning that election, he came back from the break in the winter of 1940, he sat down at his desk, and there were letters from his constituents there, many letters from people here in Missouri, near a place in the Ozarks called Fort Leonard Wood that was under construction at the time. And people were writing to Truman saying, Senator, something funny is going on here. They're doing all this work out here, but people are sitting around doing nothing. Materials are sitting out in the snow, going to waste. Contractors are getting rich. What the heck's going on here? Cool thing about Truman, there's so much fun things about Truman, but one of the best ones is he doesn't send his staffers out on a plane to investigate. He doesn't take a congressional delegation and head out there. Truman walks out of his house and he gets in his old Dodge in Washington, D.C., and he drives out to Missouri to check it out. And so here's this construction site. A very well-dressed man in a double-breasted suit shows up, and he's wandering around asking questions. There's no senatorial fanfare involved in all this. He just starts checking it out and asking questions. And he finds out that what the letter writers had said was true. Stuff getting wasted, people getting rich, guys sitting around doing nothing. It was a mess, basically. And he kept going from there to Army camps in 6 different states where he saw much the same thing. A lot of waste. He came back from, so Truman, as many of you know, he had been a war veteran himself, and so as a war buildup was going on, he was pretty concerned about the equipment and the materials and the training that the soldiers would have to prepare for the next war. And he took this seriously. He had been a county judge in Jackson County, Missouri. He had seen what happens when the taxpayers' money gets wasted. He had taken that responsibility very seriously. So this was something that was dear to Truman's heart. He came back from Washington in February of 1941 pretty ticked off. And he got up on the Senate floor and he made a speech that, hey, we should have an investigation. We should look into this. He knew also that after World War I, his war, there were 117 separate investigations after the war to find out what happened and what went wrong and what happened to all that money. Truman's idea was, okay, well, why don't we do the investigation now and maybe we can save some of that money or save some lives. Nobody, including the President of the United States, was very crazy about this. Think about that. A Democratic senator proposing to poke his nose into the business of a Democratic administration, a Democratic president who was very popular. Franklin Roosevelt was not crazy about this at all, but it quickly became clear that if the Democrats didn't do it, the Republicans were. So they tossed Truman a bone, $15,000, which is barely enough to hire a lawyer, and a couple of secretaries. And nevertheless, Truman took that, and in 3.5 years, he turned it into the most powerful investigating arm that Congress had ever seen, and one that, as I say, as Bernie Sanders can tell you, still resonates 80 years later. Truman, though, chose to do some things differently. He knew there was a Civil War committee called the Committee on the Conduct of War that had driven, same thing, that, a committee from the president's own party that had nevertheless driven Abe Lincoln nuts. They were telling him what general he should hire, and they were telling him what battle he should fight. And so Truman had basically said, okay, I'm not going to do that. He said, we won't look into military strategy. We won't tell Franklin Roosevelt what general he should be in charge or when we should invade Europe. We're just going to look at these defense contracts and the defense buildup. And that's how all this got started. Weirdly, this gave the Truman Committee, the way that the thing was worded, they were not allowed to propose legislation. They wouldn't do anything. And yet, it gave them kind of a blank slate to look into pretty much anything they wanted. And Truman took that loophole and drove a truck through it. And that's basically the story I get to tell. One of the things he had to do right away, though, was hire a lawyer to run the committee. And that was another thing that Truman did very well. Here he is running for re-election in 1940. I speak so fast and I get so excited I get out in front of my photos. So sorry, you'll have to bear with me on that. This was Hugh Alfred Fulton, another graduate of the University of Michigan. Go Blue. In 1941, he was 36 years old. He was working for the Justice Department in New York City. He had just put the head of a utility company into jail for stealing $20 million of people's electric bills and light bills, so that was front page news. And Truman had called up the Attorney General of the United States and he said, I'm starting up a new committee, an investigative committee. Give me your best lawyer. Who's that? The Attorney General, Robert Jackson, recommended this guy. So, as I say in the book, well, neither guy was very impressed with each other. Fulton didn't even know who Truman was, really, and had asked a friend who he was. Truman, for his part, said some very unkind things about Hugh Fulton's weight and his squeaky voice, but nevertheless, both men came to the agreement. Fulton took the job, and it ended up being one of the smartest decisions that either man ever made in their lives. And they got to work right away. They started off on those army camps. They picked several army camps as examples around the country, including Fort Leonard Wood, and they sent out questionnaires. They sent staffers out to investigate. And they, sure enough, their first big report about army camps was a bombshell. Front page news, the headline, the sound bite, that is the way I would say it in my profession. $100 million wasted. Contractors soaking the government. Here's my favorite example. In one army camp, and I think it's one in Florida, the government had rented Ford trucks for $885 to rent these trucks each. The Truman Committee found out they could have just bought them outright for $628. This was the kind of thing going on over and over and over again. Often these army camps are being built without concrete roads or parking lots to park a 20 or 30 ton tank, and so the tanks are sinking into the dirt. There was no fuel lines to fill them up with gas, which led to the best soundbite. Every newspaper and radio story pretty much quoted this line from the committee report. The generals were running the army along Civil War lines and had not properly worked out the requirements of a mechanized army. This, of course, while Hitler's mechanized army had gobbled up France and most of Europe. From there, they moved on to airplanes. And what America learns from the Truman Committee, one of the cool things the Truman Committee did throughout the war was give Americans news that they didn't really like all that much. And as we know, even today, the government isn't super wild about giving people unpleasant news or telling them the bad news. Well, the Truman Committee did it several times during the war, and that did a couple things. It meant that people came to trust the Truman Committee, and also, and I can speak to this personally, it meant that the news media came to trust the Truman Committee. I sit at my desk all day and reports land on my desk, and all I have to do is look at who wrote it to tell whether I need to look at it or not, or whether it's ideologically based. Very quickly on, beginning with this Army camp report, reporters and the media learned that they could trust the Truman Committee and they weren't getting spun. That was the key. And Truman did everything he could to keep some of the usual brand building and ego building out of the reports, and it worked. They moved on from Army camps, they moved on to airplanes, and what American learned here was that the bombers, the B-24s that I just showed you, bombers, we were good. We had the best bombers in the world, but the fighter planes that American pilots were flying, not so much. The planes that Germans and Japanese pilots, and the British too for that matter, were flying, were taking to the skies, were in many ways better. The committee was particularly critical of the P-40, the Curtiss P-40, my favorite fighter plane as a kid. What they clearly forgot to point out was how cool it looked, though, with a shark's mouth painted on it. I couldn't find that anywhere in the report, and it should have been in there. And on and on and on. In 1943, another giant investigation put Truman on the front page, again, of virtually every newspaper in the country. The word that appeared in most of the headlines was fake steel. Steel tests fakes on plate for ship. That's the New York Times that day. Basically, they had been getting, and this leads me, I'll take a digression here, to one of the other fascinating and completely unknown characters that I discovered, a man we would now call a whistleblower. That term I don't think existed then. This was a guy named George Dye. In 1942 and 1943, he began writing letters to Senator Truman and the committee. As I said early on, another smart thing Truman did, he went on the radio at the very first weeks of the committee and said, hey, America, we need your help. You see something funny going down in the factory, something's not right at the shipyard, you've got an idea for something that'll improve production and win the war, write to me. Harry S. Truman, Senate Office Building, Washington, D.C. And people did. One of them was this guy. His name was George Dye, and he had begun writing letters about what he saw going on at a steel plant outside Pittsburgh. He was an inspector. He was a supervisor of inspections, and what he saw was this plant cutting corners on the inspections. One of the most amazing moments for me in researching the book was after years of reading about this stuff. Bob Irvin was one of the ones sent up to Pittsburgh, and he was like, we went up, we sat in this guy's kitchen, and we checked it out. And then weirdly to me, to be sitting in the archives and actually run across these handwritten letters and hold it in my hands, it's a really cool thing. This is one of the letters that George Dye wrote to Harry S. Truman, dear sir, and he's kind of ticked off in this one. You failed to acknowledge receipt of 2 letters which I mailed November 14th, blah, blah, blah. Did you receive the letters? Basically, hey, what's going on here? So it was kind of cool to see these things. George Dye, as you can see right here, this was fun, lived at 2902 Brownsville Road. So I went up to Pittsburgh to give a talk earlier this year, and I was like, Google Map, checking it out. I'm going to go say it out. Well, 2902 Brownsville Road is a Burger King now. I was kind of bummed about that. But I did get my picture taken there anyway. I was saying to Jason earlier, one of the sad things is George Dye has his moment in history, and I'll talk about that in a second, and then he kind of faded away. He wrote a couple more letters to Truman in 1945. He wrote a long letter to the president of U.S. Steel, a man named Benjamin Fairless, saying, I'm out of here, you're back doing the same old stuff. I found him in a phone book in Seattle where he had become a steel plant inspector there. And he died in 1964 in California, but I couldn't find any relatives or descendants. I would have loved to have talked to them and shared the story of the moment that this guy, not that guy, but that this guy had in history. Anyway, they went up in George Dye's house. Bob Irvin and Rudolph Halley and Matt Connolly sat down in his kitchen, and he drew him a map of the factory. And he said, right here was a woman, this is the office of a woman named Irene Pasternak. She was the one who kept the inspection records, the records that said they were faking these steel inspections. So the Truman Committee guys, the next day, they get in the factory, and they're somewhere in here, like 10 feet away, and they're saying, hey, how do you inspect all these steel records? Oh, do you keep records of those inspections? Oh, yeah. Oh, can we take a look at them? Oh, no, you don't want to see those. They're really complicated. And the Truman Committee goes, no, we kind of like to see those records. Oh, they're scattered all over the place. It'll take us forever to pull them all together. Well, literally, they knew because of this map that those records were in Ms. Pasternak's desk, like 10 feet away. As I said, the Truman Committee didn't actually have, they weren't law enforcement officers. They didn't have, they couldn't arrest people. They couldn't do anything. They could subpoena people, which is that's what ended up happening here. But they finally do get the inspection records. I'm just going to digress and tell you this one story. They finally get the inspection records, and they're looking at them, and they're saying, some of these inspection records on these steel, they're written in pencil. What's that all about? Yeah. Sometimes we don't have the exact ink ones, so we have to call up the plant where the steel was made and get the numbers, and we write them in pencil. Oh, okay. How come some of them have an F next to them? Oh, what's that F stand for? And there's a long moment of silence. And then Irene Pasternak, sitting there, looks up at her boss, who says, oh, F. Yeah, F means phone. That means we have to call. Well, these Truman Committee guys, they were college graduates. They knew. Phone does not start with an F. And Rudolph Halley took Irene Pasternak into a room, and he basically said to her, what's going on here? And she said, and then wrote down on Senate stationery, which I also held in my hand, yeah, these steel records are fake. So this is all fascinating to me, and this is, again, where I'm kind of getting the impression I got a pretty good story to tell here. And my book tells, and if you've read the book, sorry, I'm repeating stuff, but as Jason mentioned, all this ties into the breakup of a brand new merchant ship, the SS Schenectady in Portland, Oregon on January 16, 1943. Sitting there quietly at its dock, they're loading it up for its first ever, its maiden voyage to carry millions of gallons of oil around the world. Just sitting there at 10:30 p.m., boom. Everyone hears the noise. You could hear it a mile away. The earth shook. And the ship, and when they got there, what they see is this brand new ship, $3 million ship, 500 feet long. It looks like a giant picked it up out of the water and went and just cracked it and put it back down. And so there was a big question of what the heck was going on here. 3 months later, the head of the shipyard, Henry Kaiser, we know him pretty much today only because of his healthcare plan, Kaiser Permanente, that he created for his workers. But back then, he was one of the very few people, 4 or 5 people in the United States who helped win the war on the home front. Kaiser was testifying before the Truman Committee, and he's talking about all these production miracles and efficiency he's getting out of his workers. Finally, Senator Owen Brewster of Maine says, okay, that's great, Mr. Kaiser. What about that ship that broke up at your plant? And Kaiser hems and haws. I've read the transcripts in the archives. It's pretty cool. He does not want to answer this question. Finally, he's got a piece of paper in his hand. You really want me to answer that question? They're like, yeah. And he says, well, what I'm told is that it's bad steel. That the steel that made the ship broke up is bad steel from the Carnegie, Illinois Steel Company. Well, the senators moved on to the next question, but all the young staffers like Bob Irvin are like, oh my gosh, we've got a stack of letters this thick from a guy at that very factory saying they're shipping bad steel out of this place every single day. Anyway, this was again, part of the story for me. There's a lot of policy stories to tell about the Truman Committee, but I found these kind of detective story stuff really, really fascinating. So, fake steel, they go up there, they get that investigation, and this is what newspapers all over the country look like for weeks. Fake steel investigation. And this is 1943. Truman is no longer the senator from Pendergast, no longer a nobody sitting in the back of the United States Senate. He's on the cover of Time magazine. He's on the radio every week. He is a national figure. And not only that, this is the thing American people really responded to. Here's a guy in Washington actually looking out for us. He's looking out for our sons and daughters who are in uniform right now, our sons fighting in combat overseas. He's looking out for our tax dollars and make sure it's being spent wisely. Like, wow, this guy's pretty cool. Yeah, they got a lot of letters. I will use the term they use, crackpots, they called it. Truman, people wrote in with all kinds of fun stuff, and it's really fun to sit in the archives and read those letters, too. I've told this story before. It's in the book. Truman's favorite was a guy who wrote in to say that he had a plan to win the war, which was to take every American soldier, that soldier would have his own personal airplane. And at a given moment, what you needed to do was take those airplanes and fill them up with dirt, good old United States dirt. And then all those airplanes would take off and they would fly over Berlin and Tokyo and drop that dirt on them, and that would put an end to the war. So there's gobs of these kind of letters in there. You can kind of understand why George Dye's letters got shunted off into the file. His were very dense and everything. But people were taking this stuff seriously. They were sitting down. They were sitting down at their desks and writing in. I'm going to share one with you in a minute. But in other words, all of this, Truman had struck a powerful chord with the American people. And he'd become, in 2 years, one of the best-known public officials in the country. And he'd kind of become a bit of an icon in the pop culture, which I found fascinating, too. I'm going to spare you reading that cartoon. You can look at it later. This photo I found, I wish I could have put it in the book because it cracks me up. Truman Committee. Hey, you know, what do they normally paint on the front of those airplanes, folks? Yeah, pinup girls in bikinis and everything. Here's a Senate investigating committee on the front of one of these bombers. And this is cool, too, because it kind of gets to what Jason was talking about a little while ago. This bomber is actually the Martin B-26 Marauder. It was a very popular bomber during the war. But early on, pilots, you know what pilots called it? Anyone know? The Widowmaker. Yeah. Like, it was a dangerous airplane to fly, and the wings were very short, and the requirements for the military were wrong, and they were testifying all this before the Truman Committee, and Harry Truman was like, well, you got two choices. You can either fix this bomber, or we will cut your contract off. Take your choice. And so they fixed the bomber, and so you can see some grateful airmen or pilots there took that out on Truman. So no longer could so you see, Truman's a big shot now. That's basically what the point I'm making here. No longer could he just show up at a Navy base or an Army camp. The arrival of the Truman Committee was big news. And everywhere he went, he wrote best, the national press followed him around. So here he is on the cover of Time in 1943. A backbencher no more. Along the way, and this is the fun part for me, as I said earlier, you're watching him, for me, watching him learn on the job. He was learning how to deal with the military, how to push back when needed, take a soft approach when that worked. He had no interest in embarrassing the government, certainly not embarrassing his hero, Franklin Roosevelt, or the Army, which he loved, or even the war effort, military contract. But the fun part is, when they stonewalled him, when they lied to him, when they didn't give him the documents he needed, oh, Clifton, your grandfather had a temper. I got to see that firsthand. Man, wow, watch out. And then Truman was like, okay, well, we can do it the quiet way, or here's your subpoena, and why don't you appear before the committee Tuesday morning, and we'll have all the reporters sitting there, and we're going to ask you some tough questions. And that's the way it went. I see this in my job now. And by the way, don't think the military and the contractors didn't learn and get the hang of this. After they got burned on the Army camps and the airplanes, they started to fight back. In my world now, in Washington, in journalism where I work, we call this these days, we call it a pre-buttal. That's basically a big company or somebody or a big politician comes out and says, well, National Public Radio is going to do a story on us and it's going to say X, Y, and Z, but we're here to tell you that it's all fake and it's all wrong. That's the way it works. And I saw this start to happen in some of the later investigations. You see North American Aviation or Curtiss-Wright Aviation, who made the P-40, coming out saying, hey, all this stuff they're saying about us at Truman Committee, they've got it all wrong. There's a war on. We don't have time to be answering all these questions in Washington. You know, there's a war on. So this was big stuff. And so here he is, Truman. And this is the picture I like Truman, because later on we kind of get the more roly-poly Truman, and he's, he's smiling, and he was a little more heavyset, and he's kind of an older person. This is the Truman I got to write about. He looks ready to kick some butt right there on somebody, and he's ready to take no prisoners is the look I see. And I saw that picture. I was walking down the hallway on my way to the bathroom at the Truman Library when I was doing research, and this picture is hanging on the wall there, and I was like, that's the picture I want. That was a lot of fun. And as I said, the military was getting smart at this. Here's how one of the Navy liaisons, a Lieutenant John Abbott, put it in his oral history. We would come back from the Truman Committee offices laden with complaints and be directed to carry those off to whichever of the offending bureaus were at fault or thought to be at fault. So it was our somewhat melancholy and unpleasant duty to tromp down the hall and tell some senior admiral that the Truman Committee thought he was doing a very poor job at an ordnance plant or shipyard or some other facility. But anyway, this is how the Truman Committee did its work. Very open, very much in the public, and very much I'm about to wrap up here. I want to share with you. I want to share, as I said, the American people had reached out to Truman and they wrote letters. There are thousands of these letters in the National Archives. I'm going to share just one of them that I thought is one of my favorites. It's from a guy named John Duggan. He lived in Connellsville, PA. It's dated March 27, 1943, which is about 2 weeks after the Steele investigation. Here's what Mr. Duggan had to say. Dear Senator Truman, on behalf of myself and I'm sure millions of other fathers who have boys in actual combat service, I want to congratulate you and your committee on the wonderful public service you have rendered the nation. I have 2 sons, a brother, and a son-in-law in the combat forces of the nation. 2 are at present overseas, and the others will probably go in due time. It's one hell of a situation when you and myself and millions of others who have boys risking their lives are compelled to submit to a thing of this sort, that additional profits might fall into the coffers of the Steel Company. Stay in there and pitch, Senator. You and your committee have done a swell job. Very respectfully yours, John Duggan, Jr. I couldn't go on here, but it won't be much of a spoiler to tell you that Truman ends up vice president and sooner or later president after that. But that's another book for someone else to read. So, thank you very much, and thanks for your time. Morgan, do we have questions?
Steve, thank you so much. If anyone in the audience has questions, there's 2 microphones, 1 in each aisle. And I'll also encourage those that are watching at home to type their questions in the chat on YouTube, and I will ask those ones for you at the mic.
Excellent. Here's a gentleman with a question right here. Take your time. I feel your pain right now.
Yeah, I've been reading a lot and listening to some podcasts about the Pacific War.
Uh-huh.
And of course, the Navy going from zilch and losing all those ships early on. And
Yeah.
by the end of the war, it had more ships than all the rest of the navies. How much did Truman have to do with those ships? Some of them were laid down before the war started, all those.
Yes.
But also, I didn't know this much, but Admiral Leahy, who was more or less just Roosevelt's buddy and an old guy, did he have, and he was like Roosevelt's personal buddy and liaison in conflict with Admiral King, who was chief of naval. Did he have any conflict or input or whatever at that level with Leahy or with King?
At all levels, yes, and I'm so glad you asked me this question because it gives me to tell the story that I just skipped over because Morgan was telling me I was out of time. The Truman Committee almost universally found the Navy a much tougher nut to crack than the Army. They felt like, and it's over and over the young staffers said this, the Navy, these kind of Annapolis culture of very closely knit, protect each other, and they were often more willing to look out for their fellow comrades in the Navy than really get the job done. The best example is a thing called Higgins boats, which were the landing craft that at Normandy in 1944 and on islands all across the Pacific were the boats that got, they could get 10,000 men right up to an island or Normandy. They could get them right up there. One of the biggest problems of World War II is how to get those guys off a ship and get them 2 miles to the shore under fire onto the beach safely. That apparently was a lot harder than anyone thought. The Navy had developed a design for a landing boat that it thought was just fine, but there was a guy in New Orleans named Andrew Jackson Higgins who had built a much better one. They would come down through history, they're known as Higgins boats. Dwight Eisenhower would say that these boats were a huge factor in the success of the D-Day landings in 1944, and then in countless islands across the Pacific, these boats were key. Andrew Jackson Higgins couldn't get a word in with the Navy. They thought he was a jerk, and he was. He was a bit of a loudmouth and a blowhard, but also he was a really, really good boat designer. So he shows up in Truman's office. He said, I have this great design. The Navy won't even talk to me. What do I do here? Truman calls up Admiral King. I got an idea. Let's take this guy's boat and one of your boats, and let's put it in choppy water, and let's put a 30-ton tank on it. This was a heavier landing craft called a tank lighter. Let's see what happens. So, and Bob Irvin, my buddy Bob Irvin just ends up in all the areas of the story, went down to Norfolk, Virginia to watch this test happen. And sure enough, Higgins's boat sailed its tank around the shore, landed its tank on the beach, and then came back to help out the Navy boat, which was almost as sinking at the time. And suddenly the Navy got the idea there. There wasn't a lot of influence on the big giant capital warships, but in terms of a lot of the infrastructure that helped win the Pacific War, especially those merchant ships, tankers, and things like the landing craft. The Truman Committee had a lot of influence. I don't recall, and there wasn't, except for like, there was a couple of examples where the Truman Committee ended up in shipyards. They went down deep in the bowels of some battleship being constructed, and there was a crap game going on down there that had been running for years. Like there was a corruption, things like that, but not a lot of input on the design or the effectiveness of those warships.
And those tankers were absolutely necessary with the vast Pacific.
It's funny, we focus on the battles and everything. The story of these tanker ships and the Liberty ships is just absolutely fascinating to me, and I was gobs of scholarly books have been written about them, but I really enjoyed that part of the story.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Hello.
Thank you for coming. My question's more about Eisenhower with his military industrial complex speech. And it's kind of shocking that Truman was doing that kind of investigation 15 or 20 years before, and this is the first time I've ever heard about it.
It's fascinating to me, too. Again, I feel like we all know that Eisenhower sort of railed against the military-industrial complex. Truman didn't call it that, but basically his quote was, no military man gives a damn about money. All they care about is how to spend it. That's basically the same thing Eisenhower, in his Truman-y way, that's basically him saying the same thing. But yeah, and one of the things that I feel like that Truman learned on this committee that helped him be president was he learned to kind of push back on the military, the constant demands for the military for more and more expensive and more budget. Truman learned that the hard way on this committee, and I think it served him really, really well. I think in 1941, in these early committee hearings, he was very deferential to these admirals or these generals or these sort of cabinet members. After a while, 2 years later, Truman is ready to tell them what's what, and he's ready to tell them that they're not cutting the mustard. And basically, many times to the Secretary of the Army or the Secretary of the Navy, Truman would say, listen, you can either answer my questions here quietly, or I'm going to subpoena you and you can answer them before the public. And it worked, usually. It was kind of a cool thing, and a surprise to me, as much a surprise to me as it was to you, I think.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Hello.
Hello, Mr. Drummond. First, I want to say that selfishly, I work for KCUR, the National Public Radio affiliate here in Kansas City.
Frank Moore's a good friend of mine, and I'm happy to
Excellent.
see him. Say hi when you see him.
I will do that tomorrow.
Yeah.
I don't think I'm the only one in this audience that would like to thank you for your day job and all the work you've done
Thank you
in
very
reporting.
much. Thank you. I just celebrated my 24th anniversary at NPR, and it's been the best job I've
Wonderful.
ever had in my life, so thank you for that.
With the contemporary calls that you mentioned at the beginning of your lecture for a modern-day Truman Committee, after all the time you spent in this book and knowing better than many people what the current political climate is in this country, what stands in the way of that, and would you predict there might be one?
Yeah, a couple of things. It's so toxic. We all know this, and that's really hard. I think television and now social media have really changed the way Congress works, and yet I also push back on the notion that, oh, it was a simpler time back then, or, oh, you know, you could never do this now because the media is so much more, like, man, you can read the newspapers of that time, and Truman had not one newspaper, 20, 30 newspapers that he had to read every day and be on top of, and some of them didn't like him, and anyway, it was no simpler a time then than now, but certainly the politics. The example I cite all the time, and I don't have an answer for why it isn't that way, but during Truman's 3.5 years as chairman of the committee, the Truman Committee put out 32 reports in his time as chairman. Every single one of them was bipartisan, unanimous. There was no dissenting voice. You cannot even imagine that happening today. But I will say I did learn a couple of things that I think are different about that. A lot of it had to do with Truman himself. He was willing to share credit. Oftentimes, if they were putting out a report of aluminum or something, and one of the senators on the committee, Republican or Democrat, it was in their district or whatever, he would let that senator get up on the Senate floor and deliver the report that day. Yes, it became known as a Truman Committee, and Truman tried to pretend that that was a vanity or something, but he loved it. But he was willing to share the credit. A couple of times, he had a big report, a blockbuster report. He took it over to the White House 3 days early and showed it to Franklin Roosevelt, gave him the heads up so that Roosevelt could make the changes. Literally in his memoir, Truman says, I didn't care who got the credit, I just wanted to get the job done. So some of those personal factors that they did. He hired good staff. That's the other thing. I've heard this over and over again. I went over and I've talked to a couple of congressional committees about the book and how they do their jobs now. So it's so important, the hiring of the staff and making sure you get good staff and not. Anyway, none of these are answering your question. I don't know why we have this. I do know that I have met, and some of them have reached out to me. There are really dedicated public service in Washington today who really, really want to do this stuff and they really want to do good work. Maybe it's just harder now. I don't know. Hi.
Hey, good evening. This has been terrific. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I just retired from the Army right at about a year ago, and I know you will be shocked to hear that there is still waste and abuse, etc. I, as recently as this week, got some messages from a friend of mine that I won't go into details because it might out him, but it was just enraging to me as a taxpayer. So two questions. I'm going to back up first. One, do you think Truman, or did you find in your research that Truman ever had contact with Smedley Butler?
I don't know the name. I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with who that is.
He wrote a book. He was a World War I general who wrote the book War as a Racket. So I just wondered if he in any way influenced
It wouldn't
that.
surprise me, but I just don't know. I just didn't happen to see that piece of paper that told me that fact. Yeah.
Okay, and second, and what I'm more interested in is you as a journalist.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of a little bit of a wayward scholar. My research interest is in military institutionalism. And when I go to conferences and speak and do media appearances and try to speak to people one-on-one, I try to help them understand, like, the military is not what you think it is. The national security state is not what you think it is. And there's so much fraud, so much waste, such abuse, such abrogation of constitutional rights of service members. We kind of forget that we are still citizens. And so my question to you is kind of from your journalistic perspective. How do we get people to care? You mentioned then Senator Truman would literally get contracts fixed Whereas today, the tradition is the House and Senate Armed Services Committee brings the generals and the contractors in, wire brushes them for the C-SPAN cameras for effect, and then sends them back to continue doing what they're doing. How do we get people to actually care and stop making an assumption that if to criticize the military is to abrogate your patriotism?
I totally agree, and I sympathize with the question because my wish is all those people would turn on the radio every day where we're trying to tell them this story all the time. But that's just too simple. I got invited, among the many very cool things that have happened since I wrote this book, this evening being possibly the coolest, I got invited to come up to West Point, and I spoke to poli-sci majors in a class up there. And then I was talking to the professor up there, and it was interesting the parallels between the people in the military. This will maybe a little bit answer your question. The parallels between the military and my role in journalism, where you're not making policy, you're not making legislation, you're kind of on the side, the goal is trying to stay neutral. And these officials in the Army were telling me how they face some of these same pressures we do in the media of being accused of being one-sided or partisan or whatever. I don't know the answer to how we, I will say the answer. My answer to your question, everything comes back to, for 30 years I've been a journalist, but my field of journalism is education. And I believe if we're gonna learn in this country what the difference is between a fake news article and a real one, if we're going to learn how the Constitution actually works, if we're going to learn the importance of the military and the importance of the Constitution, I think schools are a big answer to that. And I think sometimes, I think there's a current belief, and I'm kind of share it, that we've gotten away a little bit from teaching about our history and teaching about civics. There are so many pressures. Don't get me wrong. There are so many pressures on teachers and schools to do so many things that they didn't formally responsible for, that it's really hard to do this. Anyway, it's a bit of a halfway answer, I guess. I don't know what the answer is either. I share your frustration.
Well, thanks so much.
Sure.
We have time for one more question before
Here
we
it is,
wrap
right
it up
here.
for the evening.
Got him right here. Thank you so much for coming. I'm such a fan of Harry Truman, and I've always enjoyed meeting Clifton whenever he has been there for all the things that we've gone through. And I'm remembering, I can't remember the name of the author, who said that a committee is like a dog with 4 hind legs. And I thought that it was really interesting that he could follow through with a committee and come with solutions. Right now, we are faced in a world where every time there's a problem, we get a committee. Committees come up with no solutions. They come up with no answers. And journalists cannot even be labeled journalists anymore. I'm very much a fan of yours, but they're not. They are
glad to be accepted.
They are advocates for a political point of view, and we have committees, and where are the solutions? And I'm wondering, have you followed through on that? Has that piqued your interest? So that might be something you might follow through on.
Oh, sure, certainly. I think we're always really interested in trying to move. I would back up and say I think everybody knows that from the local school board all the way up to Congress, one of the standard dodges of government in the United States is to be presented with a problem and say, well, we're going to have a blue ribbon panel look into that. Mm-hmm. Having said that, what I saw the Truman Committee doing a lot of hard work is if you're not willing to study a problem, you're not willing to ask questions, you're not willing to go out in the field, you're not willing to compile a report, then you're not going to get a real answer. And I think that's the problem is, as you say, we have too many committees. Oftentimes they're not willing to do the hard work it takes.
Well, Truman absolutely was a solution guy,
yeah,
and offered much.
He certainly was. Yeah.
And my mother, I was alive during World War II, and she was a Rosie the Riveter. She could not get a job teaching. So the next thing she could do was, and you were raised in Michigan, she was at Briggs Manufacturing Company with that rivet. So anyway, thank you so much. We
thank you.
And
it's
thank
nice to hear from you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Steve, for writing the Watchdog and for coming to Kansas City to share it with Truman's best supporters.
Cool.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you all very much. Where are we going now?